Florida has more ghost towns than any state east of the Mississippi. And the wildest part, most of them didn't just die, they were eaten alive. Today we're counting down 13 abandoned Florida towns that got swallowed by swamps, shredded by hurricanes, and erased so completely that Google Maps doesn't even acknowledge they existed. These are places where people built homes, raised families, opened businesses, and genuinely believed they were building something permanent. Florida had other plans. We've got a town that hosted the signing of Florida's first constitution, and then got wiped off the map by yellow fever and a tidal wave within 5 years. A Harvard professor's dream farming community that the Everglades literally digested. A planned luxury island in Biscayne Bay where the construction crew drowned during a hurricane and the concrete pilings are still standing in the water like headstones. And a lawless Everglades outpost where Al Capone allegedly ran a brothel out of a swamp shack. If this is the kind of unhinged Florida content that keeps you watching past your bedtime, do yourself a favor and hit subscribe. Because we do this every single week, and honestly, Florida gives us enough material to never run out. Number 13, Andytown, Broward County. In 1946, a Greek immigrant named Andreas Poulos looked at a stretch of swampy nothing where US 27 met State Road 84 on the edge of the Everglades and thought, yeah, I can work with this. He built a gas station, a general store, and a small restaurant right there at the intersection. Truckers hauling produce and fishermen heading into the glades needed somewhere to stop, and Andy's place became that somewhere. Over the next 3 decades, a tiny community grew around it. A few houses, a couple more businesses, a handful of families who called this patch of roadside swamp their home. The kind of quiet, unremarkable life that doesn't make the news and doesn't ask to. For 33 years, Andytown existed peacefully at the edge of the Everglades, minding its own business. Then in November 1979, the Florida Department of Transportation showed up and said they needed the land for the Interstate 75 and Alligator Alley interchange. Every structure in Andytown was demolished. The gas pumps, the restaurant, the houses, all of it bulldozed and paved over for an on-ramp. An entire community erased so that people in SUVs could merge onto the highway slightly more efficiently. Today, there's an FPL power substation nearby with a small tribute that says Andytown 1946 to 1979 on the eastbound Okilanta 75 overpass. That's it. 33 years of a man's life work reduced to a plaque on a highway most people drive past at 80 miles per hour without a second thought. And that's not even close to the darkest entry on this list. Number 12, Eldora, Volusia County. On the banks of Mosquito Lagoon, which is already one of the least inviting place names in the entire state, a small citrus farming community called Eldora was thriving in the 1880s. The town was originally named Fairview, but got renamed after 2 local sisters, Ellen and Dora Pitzer. Families grew oranges, fished the lagoon, and lived the kind of quiet coastal life that real estate agents would now market as Old Florida Charm and charge you $500,000 for. Then came the Great Freeze of 1894 and 1895. 2 devastating cold snaps hit Florida back-to-back weeks apart, and temperatures plunged so low across the state that the orange groves didn't just freeze. They died permanently. The bark split on mature trees that had been producing fruit for decades. Entire orchards that families had spent years nurturing turned into fields of dead wood overnight. Eldora's entire economy was built on citrus, and when the trees went, so did the people. Families packed up and moved south to warmer growing regions where the frost couldn't reach them. The railroad that might have saved the town by connecting it to a broader economy never came through Eldora because developers routed the tracks to the other side of the Indian River instead. Without oranges and without a train stop, there was no reason to stay. The town emptied out slowly over the following decades. The last permanent resident of Eldora died in the year 2000. Today, one house survives. The Eldora State House is a preserved museum inside Canaveral National Seashore, open on weekends to the handful of visitors who kayak over or hike in. Everything else has been swallowed by the coastal scrub and live oaks that now cover the old town site like a blanket somebody pulled over a body. Number 11, Aladdin City, Miami-Dade County. This one sounds made up. It is not. During the insane Florida land boom of the 1920s, money was flooding into South Florida faster than anyone could spend it. Land that had been worthless swamp 5 years earlier was flipping for 10 times its purchase price. Everybody with a map and a marketing budget was launching a planned community. And the wilder the theme, the better it sold. So a Michigan-based company called the Aladdin Company, which was already in the business of selling prefabricated kit homes through the mail, decided they were going to build an entire Persian-themed planned city in the agricultural flatlands south of Miami. And they went all in. The streets were named Alibaba Circle and West Cairo Street. The plans called for a Persian-style bank building with minarets. The target population was 10,000 residents living in kit homes you could order from a catalog, because apparently that was a thing you could do in 1925. 3 disasters killed Aladdin City before most of the buildings ever went up. First, in October 1925, a railroad embargo on non-essential shipments strangled construction supplies. Then in January 1926, a massive cargo ship called the Prince Valdemar sank and blocked Miami harbor for weeks, choking off all maritime shipping. And then in September 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane tore through and flattened everything that had been built. The Aladdin Company packed up and went back to Michigan. Today, if you drive through the Redland agricultural area south of Homestead, you can still find traces of the graded street grid hiding under the nurseries and avocado groves. An entire Persian fantasy city, planned, named, and abandoned before most of its buildings ever existed. Florida in the 1920s was basically a real estate fever dream, and Aladdin City is the proof. Number 10, Ellaville, Madison, and Suwannee counties. On the banks of the Suwannee River, right where it meets the Withlacoochee, a lumber baron named George Franklin Drew built what was essentially a company town around the largest sawmill in Florida. The year was 1861, and Drew was ambitious. The town eventually had about 1,000 residents, a Masonic lodge, 2 churches, 2 schools, a commissary, and more than 500 people working the mill. Drew himself would go on to become the 12th governor of Florida. The town was named Ellaville, after Drew's African-American servant, Ella. For decades, the operation ran like clockwork. Pine logs floated down the Suwannee to the mill, got cut into lumber, and shipped out by rail. Then in 1898, the sawmill burned to the ground. And this is where the math gets brutal. The surrounding pine forests had already been clear-cut to the point of exhaustion. No trees, no mill, no town. Repeated flooding from the Suwannee River compounded the problem, and the 1-2 punch of the First World War and the Great Depression drained whatever was left. The post office shut down in 1942. Drew's mansion survived for a few more decades, getting slowly vandalized and flooded before it burned in the 1970s. Today, you can visit the stone foundation of that mansion and the remnants of the sawmills inside Suwannee River State Park. The river that built Ellaville is the same one that drowned it, which, looking back, feels like the kind of symmetry a horror movie writer would be proud of. Number 9, Fort Dade on Egmont Key, Hillsborough County. Out at the mouth of Tampa Bay sits a small island that used to be a fully functioning military town, and before that, it was a prison. During the Third Seminole War in the 1850s, captured Seminole and other Native Americans were held on Egmont Key before being shipped west to Oklahoma. The island's history starts dark and stays dark. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Army built Fort Dade on Egmont Key with over 70 wood frame buildings, 5 artillery batteries, paved brick streets, a school, and modern plumbing. At its peak, roughly 300 military personnel and their families lived on the island. It had everything a small town needed, except one thing: a reason to keep existing. Advances in naval gunnery made the fort's coastal guns obsolete within 2 decades. Fort Dade was deactivated in 1923 without ever firing a single shot in combat. The buildings were abandoned, the families left, and the island started doing what Florida islands do best: eroding. Egmont Key has shrunk from over 580 acres in the 1800s to roughly 250 acres today. That means more than half the island has simply fallen into the Gulf of Mexico. The brick streets that soldiers once walked now run directly into the surf. Concrete gun batteries sit half buried in sand, tilting towards the water like they're trying to crawl in. The only structure still operational is the 1858 lighthouse, which predates the fort by 40 years and will probably outlast the island itself. You can visit Fort Dade by ferry from Fort DeSoto Park, and it's genuinely one of the most haunting places in Florida. Crumbling military ruins surrounded by crystal clear Gulf water and nesting seabirds. If that's not a metaphor for something, I don't know what is. Number 8. Port Leon, Wakulla County. Here's a town that got deleted in a single night. Port Leon was founded in 1838 as the railroad terminus for the Tallahassee and St. Mark's Railroad. It was a busy little port town with several hundred residents, 8 to 10 businesses, warehouses, a sawmill, a hotel, 2 taverns, a post office, and its own newspaper. In March 1843, it became the seat of newly created Wakulla County. Things were going well. 5 years earlier, a yellow fever epidemic had already killed 139 residents, which you'd think would be the worst thing to happen to a town that small. You would be wrong. On September 13, 1843, a hurricane roared in from the Gulf of Mexico and pushed a 10-foot storm surge directly into Port Leon. Every single structure in the town was destroyed in a matter of hours. The railroad bridge got physically shoved upriver by the force of the water. Warehouses full of cotton and lumber were scattered across the marshland. Survivors spent the night clinging to trees and floating debris in the dark while the storm surge rolled over the place where their homes had been that morning. When the water receded, there was nothing left to rebuild. The survivors held a vote and decided to relocate inland. They founded a new town called Newport a few miles upriver and never looked back. Port Leon had been a county seat for exactly 6 months. Today, all that remains are a few weathered pilings and some interpretive markers inside the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. You need a 3.5-mile access road just to get near the spot where the town used to be. The salt marsh and saw palmetto have taken everything else. A town that had its own newspaper and 2 taverns, gone in one night with nothing but rotting wood in the mud to prove it was ever real. Number 7, Chosin, Palm Beach County. This is the entry that keeps me up at night. In 1921, a pietist preacher from Virginia named J.R. Leatherman led a group of Church of the Brethren members to the southeast shore of Lake Okeechobee to build a religious farming community. They called it Chosin, after a biblical reference to the chosen place. The settlement sat on top of ancient Native American mounds near what would become Belle Glade. The soil was rich. The families were devout. They believed God had led them to this land. On September 16, 1928, God sent a Category 5 hurricane instead. The Okeechobee hurricane drove a wall of lake water over the earthen dikes that were supposed to protect the farming communities along the South Shore. Chosin was obliterated, so were Belle Glade, Pahokee, South Bay, and Canal Point. The death toll across the region reached at least 2,500 people, and some historians believe the true number was closer to 3,000. That makes it the second deadliest hurricane to ever hit the American mainland, and the aftermath was somehow even worse than the storm itself. Most of the dead were black migrant farm workers. Under the segregation laws of the time, bodies were disposed of by race. Approximately 674 African American victims were buried in an unmarked mass grave in the Paupers Cemetery in West Palm Beach. White victims received individual burials at Woodlawn Cemetery. Hundreds more bodies were burned on funeral pyres in the sugarcane fields because the water table was so high that buried corpses kept rising back to the surface. That mass grave stayed unmarked for 75 years. It wasn't acknowledged until 2003. Chosin never recovered. The town site was absorbed into the farmland around Belle Glade. If you drive through that stretch of Palm Beach County today, there's nothing to tell you a town was ever there. Not a marker, not a memorial, not a single stone with a name on it. Just flat, industrialized sugarcane fields stretching to the horizon under the same lake that drowned an entire community of people who believed they'd found the promised land. If you're still watching, you clearly have the stomach for the real stories. Hit that like button if you think more people need to hear about Chosin, because this is one chapter of Florida history that gets buried. No pun intended. Number 6, Okilanta, Palm Beach County. Speaking of that same hurricane, Chosen wasn't the only dream that drowned in 1928. A few miles south, a Harvard-educated former college professor named Thomas Elmer Will had spent over a decade trying to build a farming utopia in the Everglades. He called it Okilanta, a combination of Lake Okeechobee and Atlantic Ocean. By 1917, it was the largest community in the area with 110 families, a hotel, a town hall, a lumberyard, a blacksmith, and a barber. Supplies arrived by boat up the New River from Fort Lauderdale, nearly 60 miles away. The problem was the land itself. The drained Everglades muck soil had what you might generously call a personality disorder. When it dried out, it caught fire. Not regular fire, spontaneous underground muck fires that would smolder beneath the surface for weeks, burning the ground itself from below, while people walked on top of it. The smoke would choke the air for miles. And when the dry season ended and the rains came back, the entire town went underwater because the drainage canals couldn't handle the volume. Flood, fire, flood, fire. Like living on a piece of land that was actively trying to evict you. A catastrophic flood somewhere around 1920 forced Will out of his own creation, and by 1925, a visitor passing through found Okilanta nearly deserted with sawgrass already reclaiming the streets. The Everglades were taking back what had been taken from them. The 1928 hurricane finished the job. Today, nothing remains of Okilanta except a paved road called Bulls Canal Road. A Florida Crystals sugar mill nearby still carries the Okilanta name, which is a strange kind of afterlife for a town that died a century ago. And in a final twist of grim irony, U.S. Highway 27 was designated the Thomas E. Will Memorial Highway in 1937. The highway that bears his name runs 4 miles from the town he spent his life trying to save. It arrived long after there was anything left to save it. Number 5, Flamingo, Monroe County. At the absolute southern tip of mainland Florida, past the end of every road and deep into what would become Everglades National Park, a tiny community of fishermen, farmers, and plume hunters scraped out a living in one of the most inhospitable places in the continental United States. By 1900, Flamingo had about 50 families living in stilt shacks, surrounded by mosquitoes, alligators, and mangrove swamp in every direction. The town existed primarily because of one industry, killing birds. In the late 1800s, the elegant white plumes of egrets and herons were worth roughly $32 an ounce, which was almost double the price of gold at the time. Women's fashion demanded the feathers for hats, and Flamingo's hunters supplied them by the thousands. Entire rookeries were wiped out in a single season. Enter Guy Bradley. The Audubon Society hired Bradley as one of the first wildlife wardens in American history and stationed him near Flamingo to protect the nesting birds. On July 8, 1905, Bradley confronted a plume hunter named Walter Smith who was poaching egrets with his sons. Smith shot Bradley dead. He was 35 years old. Smith was charged with murder. He was acquitted 5 months later. Bradley's death became a national scandal and helped push Congress toward federal bans on the commercial plume trade. The ornithologist who eulogized him wrote that every great movement must have its martyrs, and Guy Bradley was the first martyr in the cause of bird protection. Flamingo's post office closed in 1909. The town became part of Everglades National Park in 1947, and Hurricane Wilma in 2005 destroyed whatever modern infrastructure had been built near the site. The original town is now a ghost town site of coquina rock foundations several miles by trail from the current Flamingo Visitor Center. The birds Bradley died protecting, they came back. The town that killed them didn't. Number 4. Isola di Lolando, Biscayne Bay. In 1926, a company called the North Venetian Islands Company looked at Biscayne Bay in Miami and said, "You know what this needs? Fake Italy." The plan was to build an entire chain of man-made islands with names like Isola di Capri and Isola di Torcello. The first one, Isola di Lolando, broke ground on February 3, 1926, with crews driving concrete pilings into the bay floor to build a seawall. Then September came. The Great Miami Hurricane of 1926 tore across Biscayne Bay, flipped a construction barge, and drowned its crew. The mid-1920s market crash was already underway, and the hurricane killed whatever investor confidence remained. The island project died along with the workers who were building it. Nobody knows exactly how many workers died on that barge. The records from 1926 are incomplete, and the storm destroyed most of the company's documentation along with the project itself. A century later, those concrete pilings are still standing in 5 to 10 feet of water between Delito Island and the Julia Tuttle Causeway. You can see them from the causeway if you know where to look, which most people don't because nobody talks about them. Dozens of columns sticking out of the bay in a grid pattern covered in barnacles and bird droppings, a permanent monument to the exact moment Miami's first real estate bubble popped. The pilings are now a designated bird roost within the Biscayne Bay Aquatic Preserve and a documented hazard to navigation. So Isola di Lolando did eventually become an island community, just not for humans. And no, that's not a joke. That is literally what happened. Florida history writes its own punchlines. Number 3. Indian Key, Monroe County. 11 acres in the upper Florida Keys, tiny, exposed, and surrounded by shallow water in every direction. In the 1830s, a salvage operator named Jacob Houseman turned Indian Key into a thriving settlement built on the wrecking industry, which is the polite way of saying they made their money salvaging cargo from ships that crashed into the reef. About 50 to 70 people lived on the island, and for a brief period it served as the first county seat of Dade County. On August 7, 1840, during the Second Seminole War, a raiding party of between 60 and 130 warriors led by Chief Chikaika crossed the shallow flats under cover of darkness and hit Indian Key at dawn. They burned nearly every building on the island and killed 13 residents, including Dr. Henry Perrine, a prominent botanist who had been growing tropical plants on the Key for the federal government. When the attack began, Perrine hid his wife and 3 children under the floor of their home and pushed them through a trapdoor into the shallow water beneath the stilted house. Then he went back upstairs. His family survived by crouching in the water for hours, listening to the buildings burn above them. Perrine didn't make it. He was killed in the house he'd just saved his family from. His daughter, Hester Perrine Walker, published a first-person account of the massacre in the Florida Historical Quarterly in 1926. It remains one of the most harrowing primary source documents in Florida history. Indian Key never recovered as a settlement. Hurricanes over the following century erased most of what the raid left behind. Today, it's a state historic park, accessible only by boat or kayak. Stone foundations, old cisterns, and a handful of grave sites are all that remain, surrounded by turquoise water and the kind of silence that makes you very aware you're standing on top of a crime scene. The island was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1972, which is a nice gesture for a place where the history involves people being burned alive in their beds. Number 2. Stiltsville, Biscayne Bay. Stiltsville is the ghost town that refuses to fully die, and its origin story is peak Florida. In the 1930s, a man known as Crawfish Eddie Walker built a wooden shack on stilts about a mile out in Biscayne Bay. He sold bait, beer, and crawfish chowder to fishermen. The shack also doubled, according to local legend, as a convenient spot for rum running and illegal gambling, because when you're a mile offshore, the police tend to leave you alone. Other people saw what Eddie had going and thought, that looks like a great idea. More stilt houses went up over the following decades, each one more ambitious than the last. By 1960, there were 27 structures standing on pilings in the open bay, connected by nothing but boats and bad decisions. Some of them were legitimate fishing shacks, others were party houses with full bars. The community hosted the Quarterdeck Club and the infamous Bikini Club, which was a converted yacht where a $1 membership got you access to nude sunbathing on the upper deck. Both clubs were raided by police multiple times, which is an impressive law enforcement feat when the nearest police station is on the mainland a mile away and you need a boat to serve a warrant. Then the hurricanes came for Stiltsville the way they come for everything in Florida. Hurricane Betsy in 1965 knocked out a chunk of the structures. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 leveled most of what was left. A fire in January 2021 destroyed the Leshaw House, bringing the total count down to 6 surviving structures. Those 6 houses are now preserved by the Stiltsville Trust within Biscayne National Park. You can visit by permit and boat only. They sit out there in the shallow turquoise water of the bay, looking like something between a postcard and a warning. A community that started as a bootlegger's shack in the 1930s, peaked as an outlaw beach club in the 1960s, and is now a federally protected historical site patrolled by the National Park Service. If that's not the most Florida sentence ever written, I don't know what is. And if you've made it this far, you already know this channel is the only place on YouTube that tells these stories the right way. Hit subscribe. You're not going to regret it. Number 1, St. Joseph, Gulf County. Every entry on this list is tragic in its own way, but St. Joseph is the one that sounds like a punishment from the Old Testament. In 1835, a port town was founded on the Gulf Coast of the Florida Panhandle along St. Joseph Bay. Within 3 years, it was one of the largest cities in the entire state with an estimated population of 5,000 people. Hotels, warehouses, cotton presses, and mansions lined the waterfront. In 1838, St. Joseph hosted the convention that wrote Florida's first constitution. This was not some forgotten outpost. This was the political and economic heart of territorial Florida. The town's rise attracted the usual crowd of speculators, merchants, and opportunists. It also attracted ships from every port in the Caribbean and Gulf Coast, and one of those ships brought yellow fever. The disease arrived from the West Indies and moved through St. Joseph's crowded waterfront like it had been invited. Yellow fever kills by attacking the liver and causing internal bleeding. Victims turn yellow, vomit black blood, and die within days. There was no treatment and no understanding of how it spread. People simply watched their neighbors get sick and die one after another, block by block. By early 1841, the population had collapsed from 5,000 to roughly 500. People didn't just leave, they took the buildings with them. Houses were physically loaded onto barges and floated across the bay to Apalachicola, because lumber was too valuable to abandon even in the middle of a plague. By 1842, St. Joseph was a near-empty shell, but the land was still there. The bay was still beautiful. There was still a chance somebody might rebuild. Then on September 8, 1844, a hurricane known as the Great Tide pushed a massive storm surge directly into what was left of the town. The ruins were obliterated. Wildfires swept through the debris field afterward and burned whatever the water hadn't already taken. A local legend took root that persists to this day. The story says that St. Joseph was so wicked that God sent a plague of fever to punish its sins. And when the survivors refused to repent, he sent a tidal wave to wash the whole city off the map. Whether you believe the theology or not, the timeline is hard to argue with. The largest, most important city in Florida went from constitutional convention host to empty sand in less than a decade. Today, the only surviving trace of Old St. Joseph is the Yellow Fever Cemetery near the modern town of Port St. Joe. Weathered headstones lean at angles in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, marking the graves of people who built what they thought was the future capital of Florida. The Constitution Convention Museum State Park sits nearby, interpreting a story that most Floridians have never heard. 5,000 people, a constitution, a plague, a tidal wave, and a graveyard that's the only proof any of it ever happened. That's 13 towns that Florida swallowed whole. 13 communities of real people who built homes, started businesses, buried their dead in soil they thought would hold them, and believed with absolute certainty that they were planting roots in permanent ground. The swamp, the storms, the fever, and the fires didn't care about any of that. They never do. The real question is this: given everything you've just heard, given the plagues and the tidal waves and the sinking islands and the muck fires and the segregated funeral pyres, why do 1,000 people still move to Florida every single day? Maybe they just haven't watched this video yet. Share it with anyone you know who's thinking about buying property in a swamp. They deserve to know what the swamp has done to everyone who tried before them. If you want more stories like this, the video on screen right now is one you're going to want to see. Click it. I'll see you there.